All right, everyone, hello. Thank you so much for quieting down. We are just delighted to be able to present the final panel for this afternoon. This has been such an extraordinary and inspiring program. We're truly grateful to our co-hosts at the University of California Office of the President, particularly Vice President Dr. Teresa Maldonado and Vice Chancellor of the California State University Office of the Chancellor, Vice Chancellor Ganesh Raman. My name is Julianne McCall. I'm the CEO of the California Council on Science and Technology, CCST, and we are absolutely thrilled to be hosting this panel as our kickoff event for S&T Week at the Capitol, Science and Technology Week. It's our 8th annual Science and Technology Week, providing ample opportunities for legislators and officials from the executive branch offices to be able to engage with their science and technology experts in their districts and well beyond. I hope you will all be able to join us for the other events of S&T Week. Tomorrow there's the final panel of this program. I'm honored to be moderating. This evening is our annual reception and the award ceremony for Science and Public Service, where we'll be honoring Senator Ben Allen, Assembly Speaker Robert Rivas, and Secretary of Government Operations Amy Tong. That program will start very shortly after this one at 5 o'clock at the Mix downtown near, I want to say, 15th and L Streets. So for those of you who might not be as familiar with CCST, we're a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization established via the legislature nearly 40 years ago to provide science advice to our state legislators and executive branch officials. We're proud of the track record amplifying the inspired work of our network of partner institutions, including University of California system, CSU system, the community colleges, Caltech, Stanford, USC, as well as our amazing federal labs in California. My goodness, are we lucky to have Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, Lawrence Livermore National Lab, Sandia Lab, SLAC, NASA Ames, and NASA JPL, all within our California network. So in this keynote, we are diving further into disaster resilience. In 2020, CCST established programming in disaster resilience to help the state counterbalance the rising rate of natural disasters. Through our, what was eventually called the Disaster Resilience Initiative, we seek to deliver science and technology advice to, among so many other things, reduce harm to Californians and their communities through the increasingly rapid rate of disasters. With this final keynote panel of the day, we're going to explore how to ensure that that vital scientific research that many of you are conducting are actionable, right, are resulting in actionable and relevant outcomes when it comes to policy making, policy decisions that are advancing climate action, social equity, and human health. Moderating this amazing panel is Vice Chancellor for Research and Distinguished Professor of Electrical Engineering and Computer Science at UC Irvine, also a CCST board member, Dr. Pramod Khargonekar. Thank you so much. And if I could please have the full panel join us on stage as well.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. This final keynote session, I think, is a wonderful capstone to the whole day of discussions that we have been part of, going back to the very beginning of this day. We are joined by 4 wonderful panelists that I'll introduce in a second. But before I do that, let me set the stage. Julianne did a wonderful job of setting the stage already. The larger question we are trying to address in this panel is, what's the best way to connect science and engineering research as done in our universities and in national labs and the research ecosystem of the state of California, to those who potentially should be using this research, i.e. People in the state government, in state agencies, in the legislature, and they're going to put focus directly on that question in this panel. We are going to do this in the context of climate action, which has been the theme of the entire day and tomorrow. In preparing for this session, let me get my notes. I posed to the panelists 3 questions, which I don't want to ad-lib, but I'm going to read them because they are the central foci for what you're going to hear. What are the most important opportunities for major improvements in decision-making by using results of science and engineering research and data? Do you have specific success story that we can learn lessons from? So that's question 1. Question 2 is, what are the best practices for researchers to design and conduct their research, develop partnerships, and communicate the results of their work to be relevant to decision makers in the legislature, state, and local agencies? And the third one is a little bit more forward-looking question. And I think all of you can think about this. How should, in the future, formulation and conduct of science and engineering research change if our goal is to improve decision-making for climate change, adaptation, and resilience? So third one is sort of guide the future research formulations. First 2 are more about what are the opportunities in front of us and what are the best practices. So with that, I'm ready to introduce our panelists, and I'm going to go in the order in which they are sitting. So our first panelist is Wade Crowfoot. He is the Secretary of Natural Resources Agency. His agency oversees more than 26 departments and other entities with the mission of restoring, protecting, and managing the state's natural, historical, and cultural resources for current and future generations. Wade.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this conversation. And I have to say, it is so wonderful to see all of you here, such a large group of people, and as I understand it, already so immersed in so many critical conversations across this subject matter. So, as shared, I lead one of our state environmental agencies. We have 2 agencies, Cal EPA, which acts a lot like US EPA, ensuring clean water and air and protecting us against toxics and pesticides. And then we have the Natural Resources Agency, and I call that our stewardship agency. And we include entities including CAL FIRE and state parks and Fish and Wildlife, our coastal agencies. And as a result, we are really, in many respects, sort of a key leader within government on adapting to climate change and building our climate resilience. So I've long thought building the partnership that manifests here today is really, really important. Why? Obviously, California is on the front line of climate impacts. Like Mediterranean climates around the world, we face worsening droughts and floods and fires and extreme heat and sea level rise and coastal impacts. And all of this is evolving or manifesting much more quickly than a lot of us thought it would, even 10 or 20 years ago. So every day, every week, every month, we are making decisions in real time with significant amounts of funding and personnel and technology about how to help California adapt, how to protect people in real time. And this obviously came into sharp relief last month with the Los Angeles fires. I've spent more time in Los Angeles over the past month than I have in my home in Sacramento, and we have leaders from across our state government very focused on doing everything we can, both to protect folks against the wildfires and then post-fire threats, but then to help these folks recover. And it's just an example of this growing and intensifying extreme conditions we face. 3 weeks ago, I was talking about the driest start to a winter in Southern California in our state's history. And then just on Friday, we were out with the governor at the State Operations Center preparing for atmospheric rivers in Northern California. You all know this. You are Californians, you're living here. And I think we can do a better job adapting, protecting, building our resilience together. And I've long thought that we don't do a good enough job in state government in tapping into the expertise at our UCs, CSU, community colleges, federally funded research facilities. And there just isn't enough connective tissue historically. So to me, this two-day symposium and your research that was funded in part by our legislator, our governor's investment of $100 million is building that connective tissue. And I think it's already borne fruit. And I'll share a couple of examples of that. And I'll also share what I think is important moving forward. I won't belabor all of the different ways that experts have influenced and informed decision-making, but I'll share some progress in the area of wildfire, which is, of course, very topical. One example is Alert California, which is a partnership that was originated, I believe, at the University of California, San Diego, with CAL FIRE and includes other research partners. And today across California, there are over 1,000 cameras that are very strategically located on ridgetops and in high severity fire zones that utilize artificial intelligence to identify when there are anomalous images on the screen that resemble smoke and automatically contact the local fire unit. And in the first 3 months of operating the Alert California camera system with artificial intelligence, there were dozens of instances of where fires were put out by the local fire response agency before that first 911 call happened. Great example of know-how born from the UC system that actually manifested in our state fire management agency, CAL FIRE. It's actually recognized as one of the top 100 technology breakthroughs by Time Magazine, I think last year or the year before. But in wildfire, there's also the institutionalization of that expertise in what's a state and federal task force called the Governor's Wildfire Task Force that Ilkay reminded me of, that is utilizing that expertise to form a scientific advisory panel. So we are spending, well, I'd say in the last 5 years, we've spent over $10 billion between wildfire response at CAL FIRE and all of this upfront resilience work, all informed or largely informed by this task force. And this task force is now being informed by science as a result of this scientific advisory panel, which includes leaders from UC and CSU and our federally funded research labs. And likewise, something you may talk about is the data hub, where we're utilizing the best and the brightest, the super computing powers of our California institutions to actually bring to bear more information technology to actually manage the building of our wildfire resilience. So that's just a few examples in one domain. From my perspective, moving forward, we need to continue to do what we're doing right now, which is building relationships. At the end of the day, the way that expertise informs decision-making may very well be a peer-reviewed study that takes 2 or 3 years, but oftentimes it's not. It's serving on that scientific advisory task force. It's figuring in on a specific management question in a quiet way based on an existing relationship with a research unit of a state department. There's so many different ways that this can manifest. I just want to give one more example because I saw Steve Monfort from the UC Reserve System. We have an effort called 30 by 30 to build conservation and protect lands across the state, 30% by 2030. And it's the UC Reserve System, it's the Natural Resources Department, or School of Natural Resources at UC Berkeley, it's others that have actually informed the pathways to get there and actually established what's called the California Biodiversity Network to bring that scientific expertise to bear. So I am really bullish on these relationships. I want to continue to figure out ways that we can invest state funding to enable more of this to happen, because as I see it, if we can't do this in California, then where can it be done? We face, among the sharpest climate risks, we have the most talented people in the world studying this, that's you all, and we have a government, I think, that's more committed than almost any other to take the action we need to against climate change. So the time is now to continue and deepen the work that we're doing together.
That was really a wonderful response to my, my questions, and I was really struck by the concrete examples you gave of success and the partnerships as the key to keeping it going. By the way, we are going to have time for your questions, so keep thinking about questions at the end of our panelists' talks. So our next panelist is Liane Randolph. She's the chair of the California Air Resources Board. CARB is the lead agency for many of states' key climate change programs and regularly taps into the latest science and technology research to inform their decision-making. Liane?
Thank you so much for having me here. I'm looking forward to this discussion. So the Air Resources Board is at its heart and has always been a science-based organization. You know, the first person who held my position was the scientist who discovered the causes of smog in the LA basin, which led to the first regulatory action in the United States on that issue, which ultimately led to CARB, which ultimately led to US EPA. So if anyone tries to tell you that California's unique authority is not appropriate, you can remind them that we predated the US EPA, and we need to continue to have the opportunity to lead on tackling air quality challenges and now climate change. So, you know, we have always relied on research and public health analysis to do our work in air quality, understanding what the sources of the various criteria pollutants were, inventorying those sources, identifying what the right strategies were to reduce those sources. And so we have always had that very close relationship with research and are able to fund our own research as well. With the passage of AB 32 and the beginning of California's work to combat climate change, CARB was given the responsibility to chart that path forward on the strategies needed to reduce emissions and achieve those climate change goals. And so we have done that periodically. Every 5 years, we update our statewide climate change scoping plan, and that relies heavily on the work of you and other people around the world to really identify what the right strategies are and what the right, you know, the emission sources and how they interact with our industry and our land here in California. And so I'll take a moment to talk about a key success story that we had in research, which relates to when the most recent climate change scoping plan, the board adopted at the end of 2022. And for the first time, that climate change scoping plan included a chapter about natural and working lands. AB 32 is structured to identify specific sources of greenhouse gas emissions and short-lived climate pollutants, but we had never, so we've always analyzed sources of, you know, industrial activities and other anthropogenic sources of emissions, but we had not yet had the ability and the opportunity to dig deep into our landscapes in California, how those landscapes can sequester carbon, how management of those landscapes can help with that fight against climate change. So we were able to do a couple of years of deep data-driven work in partnership with the Natural Resources Agency to develop that chapter, and importantly, to identify next steps, how that research can be better. And so the legislature gave us the responsibility to work with the Resources Agency to convene a stakeholder group to understand how nature-based solutions can reduce carbon emissions in California. And that work resulted in specific climate targets that related to each of our natural and working lands. How can we use strategies like managing our forests, how we can manage wetlands, what are the things that we can do to reduce carbon emissions and to sequester carbon in our natural and working lands. And so now we have those targets, and that gives us a roadmap to say, okay, how are we going to, from a regulatory standpoint, make progress? What investments are necessary? What can the private sector do voluntarily or through market-based mechanisms to achieve the goals we need to achieve? And that was all the result of many years of careful data analysis and working with experts to try to evolve the discussions around sequestering carbon. So I'm sure we'll have an opportunity to talk a lot more about examples of how we work with our partners. You know, there are many folks in the room that I see regularly that we have the opportunity to do this work together, and we have, you know, such a key relationship with UC, Cal State, our community colleges. We have a lab in Riverside that is on UC Riverside land, and when we built that lab, we entered into agreements and partnerships all the way K through 12, community college, Cal State, and of course UC Riverside. And so we will continue to do that work, and eager to talk about more examples as we have the discussion this afternoon.
Thank you. Liane, in your response, you did a great job of highlighting the scoping plan and the nature-based solutions. And so you opened a whole new set of opportunities where science and engineering research meets our needs in climate change. And we'll come back to some of these ideas in the discussion. So our next panelist is Ilkay Altintas. She is a research scientist at UC San Diego. Among the many hats she wears, she leads the Cyber Infrastructure and Convergence Research Division at the San Diego Supercomputing Center, where she leverages expertise in data science, AI, and advanced computing to develop partnerships and projects focusing on achieving scientific and societal impact. Ilkay.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here. So I'll start with a personal story. I came to San Diego Supercomputer Center in 2001, and a colleague sort of installed a sensor in my room. I'm like, what are you doing? He's like, oh yeah, we are building this network in the back county of San Diego, America Online, if those of you who remember. And because there is no network in the back county, and scientists now can have real-time access to their sensors. Can I use your office to test it? I'm like, be my guest, as long as I can use that data. So we were doing this real-time streaming data, 2001. 2003, October, I'm at National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis in UC Santa Barbara. I receive a text from my then boyfriend, now husband of more than 20 years. Be careful, there are fires. I'm like, okay, why do I need to be careful? I'm in the coast. That day, on a Sunday, train service from Santa Barbara to San Diego was broken. I had to get on a colleague's pickup truck. One side was sunset, one side was fire. It was the first time in a long time that a fire of this magnitude was in Southern California. I was like, no information. I didn't have internet access at UC Santa Barbara. Fast forward 2007, another fire that's utility-induced in San Diego. We had some more understanding. Some things happened in the middle, but my colleague Larry Smarr was NASA advisor to NASA administrator. A phone call to NASA. There is one iconic shot of a satellite image from that fire. So there was nothing else. So this is where we were at. 2006, there was an oil spill in the Gulf. We had some collaboration. We were putting drogues out in the ocean, following the ocean currents and streaming that data, having a hard time streaming that data. So we were doing dynamic data-driven, this real-time data with physics-based models integration. So 2007 fires, in the aftermath of that, SDG&E started putting weather stations in that network that was being built in 2001 in the back county of San Diego, HPRAN. It also had the original camera network, which is now Alert California, that also inspired that. And suddenly it started inspiring us. Can we do the same thing we've done for ocean currents, for fire behavior? So we had this National Science Foundation project just to see real-time data when it becomes available. can we integrate it with predictive models, existing models, and assimilate that data, so to say, to explain fire behavior, maybe predict a few hours into the future, a few days into the future. So we created an infrastructure for it. 2014, LA fire chief calls me, and he's like, I think you're doing fire modeling, can you help us? We get on the helicopters, look at all the fuel load in Hollywood Hills and all kinds of places. And he's like, this is our problem. If there's a fire 2 hours from Hollywood Hills to the ocean, we have an initial attack problem. Can you build tools for it? And he's like, and at the same time when he called me, it was a big sewer fire. I was trying to get $50,000 in grant money from NASA so I can fly an aircraft over it to collect perimeters that will help me to make the case. So he's like, what do you need? I'm like, I need perimeters. So we sort of had this engagement and started building a tool called FireMap based on NSF funding, but initially it was just an exercise, a research exercise. Fast forward, it became a public-private partnership that is called FIRIS, Fire Integrated Real-Time Intelligence System, $30 million governor's program led by Cal OES in partnership with CAL FIRE. Why did I tell this whole story? It took 20 years for us to get there, and it was very painful at best. And as a scientist, I fell into it. But this created a methodology for us. Right? What LA Fire Chief did for us was an identification of the gap. Initial attack problem, I'm a metro agency and I need this. And he enabled us to do that, and NSF funding enabled us to do that at the time. But how do we get that faster? So we developed the whole methodology for it. What are the ways to assess the needs, identify the gaps, and identify what's useful? And then couple that to what we know best as scientists and technologists. Right? It's the data science, advanced computing, but also cutting-edge science integrated with that. And also workflows, right? What kind of workflows would that be useful for decision support or for other types of usefulness? And through that, we incubate, through funding, something that's usable. Useful to usable, take some funding, and it typically exists in research funding. But then how do you take that usable thing and use it at scale? So UCCA funding, for instance, become really important for us here, because then you can create a partnership around it, but how do you go from being usable to being used at scale in a methodology? So is that a public-private partnership? Is it, university-developed, government-owned? Or there are lots of different models. So now in Convergence Research Institute, we are teaching the methodologies we created, but we are also looking at pathways. What is that useful to usable to use at scale pathway? And thank you for that, useful. And this is a loop, right? It's not like one-time thing, and it's a bi-directional dialogue, and as we learn more, that's why it's important to create partnerships and collaborations, because innovation doesn't happen in one step. It's actually a collaborative loop, and there's always room for improvement. There's always new climate understanding and need for action. How do we create those methodologies and systems and frameworks that we can collectively impact and actually figure out how we can solve existing problems through better science and technology? Thank you.
Thank you, Ilkay, for weaving your personal story and this wonderful methodology that you came up with. So it's a marvelous glimpse at what we can do together in partnerships. And we'll come back to some of your ideas in the discussion. Our last but not the least speaker, panelist is Arianne Teherani. She is the founding co-director of the UC Center for Climate, Health and Equity. In this role, she leads faculty and staff across the UC system to develop just climate that promote human health. Arianne?
Thank you, everybody, for having me here today. It's been an awesome panel to be a part of and learn alongside with them. So I am on faculty in the School of Medicine at UCSF, and I am one of the two founding co-directors for the Center for Climate Health and Equity. The two of us, I will say, were brought together to work together through these UC-wide initiatives about maybe 10 or 12 years ago, and then eventually, the idea for the center was born out of that. The center really is a 10-campus, 5 healthcare system focused effort, and we work with students, faculty, staff, and really our focus is along the continuum of research. So how do we make sure that we are making those visible impacts of health from climate change? How are we harnessing the expertise of the UC system in order to be able to see health as a solution to the climate dialogue? We also work very much at the intersection of education, and sort of education looks at our learners all the way through our communities. And I'll give an example of that in just a second. And we also work within sort of our healthcare systems, and we think a lot about decarbonization of our healthcare sector, which is a hugely emitting contributor to the climate change space. And so, and also personally, I come to this dialogue from a space of being a researcher and evaluator of very large-scale interventions for the past 20 plus years through the CDC, the National Institutes of Health. And so I often think about data and how to make it actionable, how to make it relevant to decision-making. For those of you who are not familiar with the Lancet Countdown, it is the sort of IPCC report for health, and it comes out every year, kind of gives a summary of where the status of health is in the climate change dialogue. And in 2019, they put out a very affirmative statement that said the life of every child born today will be profoundly impacted by climate change, and we are seeing that. We are seeing that right now with the wildfires. We are seeing that with every event, every climate event that's happening through the state and throughout the world. And so for me personally and for the center, we often think about why health is not up front and center in most of the dialogues. If you look at the current data, health plays about this much of a space. It's there, it's brought up, but its presence is very minimal, and we're actually seeing a downward trend in the mention of health across sort of the climate change discussions. And part of that is very, very normal and very natural. We have to get to the root of the problem of global warming, and so that needs to be the upfront and center discussion. But health is a very, very personal part of the climate change dialogue. It affects everybody in this room. It affects all of our families, all of our friends. And so it can be a politically contentious issue, but it is a very personal and deep issue. And so making sure that the greatest area that I think needs improvement is making sure that climate change and health is a part of all the climate change dialogue that we're having, be it in understanding the pathways to ill health, and also understanding how those solutions in health, I think our panel this morning talked about this, is that how can we think of where the benefits are to health and to climate, and how to capitalize on those in order to think of future solutions. In terms of our center and sort of thinking about where we have chosen to expend our energy and our effort has, like I said, has been across a broad range of things, but a couple of things that have played a very powerful role in thinking about where we want to go next. One is we really have been working on developing this, what we're calling a climate and health dashboard, which really brings together all sorts of variables, be it climate variables, all sorts of health variables, whether it's starting from reproductive health all the way through mental health, and also bringing social and structural factors at each of sort of our zip code levels, and looking to see how can we basically work to make sure that our lawmakers, our public, our researchers have access to that granular level data to see how health is impacted throughout our state. The other piece that we're working on, which I will have a chance to talk tomorrow about in greater depth, and it was actually a project funded out of this wonderful effort, is our innovations and entrepreneurship focus on the vulnerability profiles, where we have also taken a whole host of data and using sort of machine learning techniques, being able to build vulnerability profiles. We're starting really in the Bay Area in particular, and looking to see by zip code level, how do we know which communities are at most risk for which health outcomes based on which climate events, and then be able to work with those communities to think about what are the solutions, how can we work together to think of where those solutions can be that can help protect health. And so sort of circling back to say, I do see health as being a very critical piece of the puzzle that has to be at the table for all of the dialogues. With that, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Arianne, for sharing the situation with climate and health. And it's a little bit discouraging that you see a trend down, which we should absolutely talk about in the discussion. But also sharing with us what you are doing at the UC Center. I mean, with the dashboard and sharing of the data and building the partnership. I mean, that sounds very promising, and I hope it will scale up in the future. So please think about your questions, and there is a microphone over there. While you make your way to the microphone, I will toss a question to the panelists. I mean, I was really blown away by, Ilkay, your story of 20 years, and now we have Alert Fire, that where you highlighted as something that is making a real difference in real, as we do this work. And it occurs to me, like, should we have waited 20 years to build this thing, right? I mean, did we know that we should have been building Alert Fire in 2001 and we should have had it ready in 2005? I mean, why did it take us so long? Past is past. Let's talk about the future. Can we think of big opportunities for the state of California where we build things like Alert Fire, which make real difference in how we deal with climate resilience and climate action in different sectors? So we talked about wildfires, but that's not the only area where we face challenges, Wade. I mean, you know this better than Liane. So talk about big opportunities that we should be acting in an accelerated pace now, so that we don't wait for 20 years, but in 2 or 3 years, we stand up major assets that can help the state be more climate resilient. So just an open invitation for you to dream big. and no particular order, so you take it the way you want.
So a big part of the 20 years, by the way, Alert California also took 20 years, right? From the first HPRN network to Alert California. So a big part of that, I think, was culture building and building new models of how do we work together collectively, not just technology built in the agencies, but externally developed, university developed, or nonprofit developed, or anyone developed technologies to actually come and be a part of the agencies and creating those working models. And I think we are coming closer to it. And the other things is, again, building within science incentive structures also for faculty to be working in these. This whole program is an incentive structure. Right? Being able to actually value the work that has societal impact as much as scientific impact. I can talk forever about this.
Well, you'd probably expect me to say this, but I think we are very excited about artificial intelligence and the role that it can play. Obviously, there are a lot of concerns as it relates to energy usage or suboptimal or negative uses of artificial intelligence. But I gave one example of the implementation or integration of AI into wildfire, but I think there's a ton more. The challenge with it is just being candid. People like me, I won't speak for Liane, but people like me are not that creative about how you utilize technology or how you take the best knowledge. We have our nose to the grindstone trying to solve problems right in front of us. I think what we would ask from you all is to understand to the extent possible the challenges we face and like what decisions or what information we need or what can we be doing better. and then utilize these channels, either through CCST or relationships that you have, to make these suggestions to us. Because I imagine there are great ideas, incredible technology platforms that could be scaled, that either are existing or are being built across California. But we just don't have the field vision or necessarily the creativity to identify those on our own. So that's what I would ask for, is bring us your great ideas, and hopefully it won't take 20 years to actually implement.
And I'll piggyback on that a little bit, because the way I think about, making progress is really thinking about kind of what your key priority is. What's your fundamental problem statement, right? And we know as CARB, our fundamental problem statement is improving air quality and tackling climate change. But how do we focus our research efforts in ways that move the needle? And so I'll give you an example. We have a relatively small annual research budget where we get to make grants to do research that we just decide all by ourselves we want to do. It's not necessarily tied to legislation or something specific, but it allows some creativity. And so the last few years we have really focused on the issue of equity, vulnerable communities, and public health impacts of climate change issues. And so we have sort of reoriented how we choose these projects by building in a community component, building in some interaction with community groups. We have a formal kind of research advisory committee, and staff has really tasked that research advisory committee to work directly with the communities and thinking of specific research projects that can help advance the needle on, advance the ball, whatever, advance something, some analogy, in ways that will directly use our climate change dollars and mandate to improve public health for residents, particularly in the San Joaquin Valley and the Coachella Valley, parts of the state that are really heavily impacted. And this whole question of public health, the public health impacts of climate change, is just so critical. I was in Los Angeles on Friday with the South Coast Air Quality Management District, kicking off the research, that they're going to do to take sampling to understand the toxic impacts to residents as they're coming back to their communities to try and begin the rebuilding process. And all of the work that the county and US EPA are doing to ensure that the hazardous material cleanup is as effective and protective of public health as possible can only be aided by doing that air quality monitoring and sampling to understand those impacts and build on that science, so that unfortunately when we have to do this again, we know even better ways to protect public health throughout that process. So those are just a few ways I sort of think about setting a North Star as you're kind of talking about what the next research challenge is.
I completely resonate with that, and I won't add very much more to that, just to say that that's been the fundamental philosophy that's also governed the way, for example, we have given out seed grants, and our center is academic and community partnerships, academic and public sector partnerships, so banks, schools, you name it, and then really employing sort of that, what we call this sort of sieve and funnel model, where there is a lot of research data out there, and who knows what to do with it, who knows how to distill it, how can we then bring it and make sure it is actionable at some point. So working with those public sector groups, working with communities to decide sort of what is the landscape of research that we need to think about. So for example, how are we gonna think about, child health and wildfires? What do we know from all the research? Which is the most relevant to the situation that we have? Because that comes through sort of the sieve, which is then eventually those final sort of most contemporary practices or those contemporary research recommendations are then being pulled out through the sieve, which are then subsequently being funneled to different groups, whether it's policymakers, whether it's public health departments, in order to make make decisions and make changes based on that most recent data. One example of it that has been very helpful to us, and also I'm hoping the community, because we've heard otherwise, is that with the wildfire incidents in LA, we were able to do a quick sort of health response and organized a series of webinars and trainings that really, we were hoping brought together the most contemporary evidence, but channeled into how people can protect themselves and how our UC community can also be trained to educate others further on. So really having a series of what do you do during and after wildfires to protect your health? What does the current research say? And then really also looking at sort of the gamut of mental health, which has had a huge impact on our communities and on the state in general. How are we training our UC students, faculty, and staff to be able to provide needed mental health resources to our communities?
Thank you. We have many questions lined up there. We have about 12 minutes, so let's make the questions pointed and let's have the responses be as pointed.
Thank you very much. Ami Alden from UCSF. My question is for Secretary Crowfoot. Very nice to see you. I want to acknowledge our faculty member, Arianne Teherani, on the panel and appreciate her remarks about wildfire and the impacts of wildfire smoke on health of vulnerable populations. We are trying to bring those good ideas to the legislature, to the governor, to the administration, and you made some great comments about how important relationships are. One of the relationships we're going to build is with Jackie Irvine, the chair of the Climate Change Committee, because as you know, her entire district, or the wildfires in Pacific Palisades, were entirely within her district. So my question to you about relationships is, who else should Dr. Teherani and I and the rest of these folks be talking to about climate change? Who are like your top people or top agencies in the administration, in the legislature that we should be going out and offering, for example, the UCSF Center on Climate, Health, and Equity as a resource to help shape policymaking, especially as that's falling apart in DC. We want to help the governor be successful in California. Who should we be talking to?
Yeah, great question. Incredible to see you again, too. Well, one thing, let me make a clear point, that the work that we do together has never been more important. You've probably seen online how all of the federal data on climate change is being shut down, literally deleted off the servers as we meet. So the work that we do to advance this is going to supplant what has been incredible federal work for a very long time. Look, you have 120 legislators in Sacramento, in state government. You have a governor, you have the other leaders, and they're all, well, not all of them, but most of them are really leaning forward on these priorities. And they have an interest in understanding what they need to do and what they should be doing. Legislators want to legislate and identify what they should be directing people like us to do. But then our agencies are trying to figure out, okay, what do we need to know, in real time? So I would say, first and foremost, come up here and engage. Come up to Sacramento. It's remarkable how little actually we get asked to meet with researchers or experts that actually want to bring some expertise and have specific suggestions. So in our agency alone, there are any number of departments that have entities that really want to be making as smart a decisions as possible. So I would say, start at the agency level, and maybe where governmental affairs folks come in is to say, hey, look, there are 5 nodes of expertise that we think are really topical right now. Fire being a great example. And we want to figure out how to plug in. Can you help us, structure half a day in Sacramento to come to start to build relationships with decision makers? I think that there's a real thirst for that. And I think at our level, at the political level, we would help you and your smart people point in the right direction.
Thank you.
Hi, Roger Wakimoto from UCLA, and thank you so much. This is a really, really tough problem. And your examples, although they're successful, also show a lot of pain in trying to get there. So a couple comments and a question. One is, we own part of the problem in the university because our reward system isn't well matched. I mean, peer-reviewed publications, and sometimes not doing community-engaged research is persuaded, except for engineering. And so you just don't get rewarded, and we have to rethink our reward system in the university. Another example that you really didn't touch upon, the most wicked problems are interdisciplinary problems. You didn't really say that too much, although you mentioned health as an example. If we always think about interdisciplinary, I think we do bring in these groups so something doesn't fall off the table. The question I have for you, though, is the agencies. What could they do? Because we're talking about supercharging this to be more successful. Have you thought of being more like in the DARPA mode or the ARPA mode, where you're more engaged with the end product, such that if you don't see the progress, you're going to pull the funding, which is what DARPA and ARPA do. I mean, I don't think you're doing that model right now, but have you thought about that seriously?
I guess I'll start, having been, at the PUC and at CARB, where we are really sort of thinking about those end products, right? Thinking about the technology forcing strategies, thinking about how do we build policy that creates strategies that actually reduce emissions in the real world, and how do we build those markets? And we have this whole suite of market-based strategies and regulatory strategies that are really, designed to do that. And those strategies start with that research. They start with, what's the end goal, and how do different sort of pieces of the puzzle achieve that end goal. So we really do try to kind of think about how we push innovation forward to meet our goals.
Yeah, and I'm with you on the incentive structure. I mean, while there are peer-reviewed studies that take 2 or 3 years that are very helpful for us, most of the time it's interventions that are more nimble, that are more nuanced than that big, broad study. And we want to help more of that happen. So whether it's using state government to lift up research, which hopefully makes it more competitive, for research dollars, help us figure out how to lift up those among you who are actually engaging in a direct way that may not be in the best interest of a non-tenured faculty member, but ultimately they're doing that. Like we need more of that. And then as it relates to research dollars, I'd love to see the next time we have a general fund surplus, another $100 million to UCs, CSUs, but I'd like to try to institutionalize more of that connective tissue. Because I think, this convening is frankly only because, of some visionary leaders within academia to really, and I would say suggestions from people like us, to really figure out how to do that. But let's figure out, like, and CCST can do this, how we start to institutionalize more of this. And maybe we're putting more state funding in more consistently for research, but then also influencing more directly the research agenda.
Thank you, Wade. And Liane, next question.
Thank you. My name is Marcus St. K. Harris. I'm from an organization called Frontline Catalysts, and I really appreciated the intersectionality mentions between climate change, climate crisis, and health, public health, because I think that's one thing that gets overlooked so much. And our organization was kind of built out of that in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. But I want to kind of point to this data element and more intersectionality specifically. Our organization specifically looked at COVID-19 pandemic deaths in Oakland, those maps of the highest impacted areas. Similarly to that was the health indications around air quality and asthma-related issues in our communities. Similarly, things like lead contamination. These data maps looked very similar. And so the one intersectionality that I don't think we talk enough about, though, is economic inequities and how that goes into play in research and data-driven opportunities, because those same maps that held those exact data points were the same maps that looked exactly the same as the redlining maps and the diverse different races and low-income communities that we acknowledge, right? So if this is a data point that we know, and I think everybody in this space knows that, how do we hold? I specifically want to ask in regards to that, how do we hold the decision makers accountable to the actual data points that are needed to address not just climate change and the fact that we know that we're trying to combat it, but the resiliency that we need to move forward and keep our people, not just those in those communities, but all of us as a society, engaged in a way that we can overcome the challenges that this is gonna take on us.
I think that's a very, very good point. And my esteemed colleague, Neetha Thakur, who is a pulmonologist, often talks about this. She has done incredible work on understanding, like we have all these incredible ideas for what we think solutions are, but we don't really look at the barriers to the uptake of those solutions in the climate and health arena in particular. And when we don't look at barriers, then we don't look at barriers, and we also don't look at what you're referring to, which is the intersectionality of how those impacts play out. You know, we go out and we do the work and we collect the data, and we don't collect it from a broad range of different groups. For example, adults living with disabilities, unhoused populations, and looking at that sort of in comparison to our overall data and using that to make it more actionable. And I think part of it is, I think the very sort of the question that was asked first by Ami is that, you know, how do we get that data in front of the people who need to see it, and how do we make sure it's the right data, that the community has had a voice in that data? So that's the even funnel model that I alluded to earlier. And I think that is something that I know on our end we are working through every day. We even have another sort of set of studies that are looking at work with the community and how to make sure that's actionable. And some of the work that we did in and around sort of the health response to wildfires, the webinars provided, really also engaged policymakers to understand what are the things that they need to understand. So please come to the webinars, like disseminating that information to them, to please come to the webinars to understand what are the problems that will be facing our communities and how they can act on that. But I do think it is a big gap in research and in practice that we do need to continue to work on. And there was one other point I wanted to just also make about community engaged research. It is true that community, as we think about sort of this idea of what do we do with funding when things take longer or things have to pivot, I do think we have to keep in mind that community engaged research will take longer. It will take time. And so we do have to give it a different space and a different acknowledgement to be able to accomplish its goals compared to sort of other more rapidly moving research.
May I add just 1 minute that I think this is an important issue, and it needs to also have a conversation around data as infrastructure, because, you know, I turn on the flip and my power flows. I don't have to think about it. But it's not because these things aren't doable, because we don't have the right infrastructure and we don't think data is infrastructure. It's not just bits and storage. It's services on top of that. It's collaborative frameworks and marketplace around data. And also, when we work with data, it's making sure we can not just find it and use it, but also understand its usability, interpretability, its timeliness. Is it the right time to use this data? Is it expired? Or it's space and time in data, actually. These are infrastructural components, and it's so difficult without thinking of data as an infrastructure for individual researchers and science community to actually tackle these challenges alone. So Wi-Fi Lab, there is one thing that we've done in our work, it's really building data as an infrastructure. It's become fundamental to right now what we call the Wildfire Commons, which is a congressional redirect supported by Senator Padilla and Representatives Jacobson Vargas.
Yeah, go ahead, Liane.
Sorry. You said, you know, how do we hold policymakers accountable? I think it's really important to name the issue, because particularly in air quality, people think, oh, well, it's air, it affects everyone the same, and it so does not affect everyone the same. And being willing to articulate that very clearly and design strategies to address that, that's the accountability conversation that, you know, needs to happen with us as agencies and with legislators.
Thank you. I see 4 more people there standing with their questions. Unfortunately, I think we have run out of, I'm looking at organizers here. And I'm asking whether we can go longer or you want us to bring this to an end. Well, I'm getting signals that we have no more time, so I'm sorry. We cannot take your questions, but there is tomorrow. I'm sure there will be opportunity for you to ask your questions. Please join me in thanking our wonderful panelists.